Hello, hello, good morning, and welcome to another podcast of She Emerged Sisterhood. I am your host, Sophia, and this morning we will be speaking on all things grief and understanding what healing looks like. So today with me is Dr. Catherine Puentes. And so I am so grateful that she's able to sit in this space with me. She was here before, and what a phenomenal time we had just chatting on all things mental health and wellness. And today she is back to share in this community another segment. And of course, we know she has a wealth of information. She has, a background in not only family therapy, but also she is a licensed mental health counselor and a supervisor as well. So if you're looking for a supervisor, she resides in South Florida and she's able to meet you where you are. And not only that, she works from a relational lens as well as a licensed mental health counselor. So today, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Catherine to the stage at this time.
Hi, Sophia. It's wonderful to be back again and to talk about another topic surrounding mental health.
Yes, I'm so grateful that you're here today with us. So, today, as we delve into, all things grief, I know it's a very sensitive topic. So, we want to be mindful of where you are as well in your healing journey.
Mhm.
And so, Dr. Catherine, if you would be so kind to share what is grief?
Yeah, so grief is definitely a natural emotional response that we might have, and even a physical one.
Mhm.
So if someone's watching this and they're already grieving, like just fair warning that a lot of the stuff that we are talking about might put you in that emotional state again, or that physical one where you feel like you need to let out that grief in some way. Grief isn't just linear, so it can be many different things. Like we can like grieve like a loss of a loved one, a transition in our life, going from one job to the next, a friendship that no longer exists, who we were years ago compared to who we are now. So grief can be many different things.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I like the idea that you were able to break it down in terms of grief is not only losing, a loved one, but also friendship, right? So you have that relational grief where people you considered, close to you at one point, you have to grieve that loss of them not being there as well, right?
Right.
So with that, what are some of the stages you would say of grief?
So for grief, it can be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, or even acceptance. But grief isn't linear. So we can bounce between those different stages. And the best way I can describe grief is like, let's say we have an object that we hold on to all the time, or, our kids go to school and they carry a book bag. So you imagine that grief in the beginning, it's very heavy. Like
Mhm.
it's overwhelming. And then as time goes, that weight lessens, but we never drop it. We never forget it. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. We know it exists. But we become stronger to be able to navigate those different phases of grief. So one morning we might be extremely angry. And then that night we might be sad. And then the morning of, we might be in that acceptance stage. And then we go back to anger again. So there's no like linear way to how to grieve, and it fluctuates. So there's no wrong way on how we grieve either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it also sounds like there's a lot of adaptation going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
have to adapt to and lean into the space of what is happening, you
Right.
know? Very often, like we get clients who feel stuck in one space in terms of it may be denial, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and how can they navigate from that denial, what are some of the assessment you're able to utilize so they can?
So there are assessments that I do give, but I like the personal route of having a
Mm,
conversation with my
mhm,
client because assessments, we can justify it in different ways. Like we might say yes for this and no for the other.
mhm,
But how I like to approach it with my clients is asking them those open-ended questions like, how are
mhm.
you doing today? Like, when did you notice things entirely changed for you?
Yeah.
When did you feel like you couldn't hold on to the emotion anymore? Or when did you feel like you totally try to numb yourself from even thinking about those emotions?
Mhm, mhm. I love that approach that you mentioned, because then it's also that relational aspect where you want to be able to, hold space for your clients so that they can verbalize, all the acumen that they are, contending with. And so that is so important, because a lot of times, as we know, even working from a mental health lens, that assessments, sometimes you have to test and retest. But if you're doing that, approach, sometimes you don't get all the information as you would if you're actually having a conversation, you
Right.
know.
Right. And grief looks differently for everyone. So, like, a
Mm,
kid is going to grieve entirely different than an adult.
mm,
So, a kid might lash out aggressively and show more behavioral than an adult that might be more emotional or cut off their feelings.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I like that. And then also I'm also thinking about, if you're able to hold space for your clients who are grieving, you can also utilize the genogram, as a way to build that rapport, to see how they, or how often are they, navigating grief as well. Yeah,
Yes.
I absolutely love that. And so what are some of the actionable steps that they could, take when they're grieving?
I do like how you brought up the genogram because this also leads to actionable steps. Because
Mhm,
if they were taught, we grieve by not talking about it, they might think,
mhm,
okay, let's not talk about it because that's a way to not grieve. Because if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. We don't feel
mhm,
it. We don't have to feel sad. But actionable steps would be the opposite of that, like
mhm,
actually talking about it and going through that pain and feeling the pain and not just ignoring it.
mhm,
Um, Talking to someone definitely helps too. So having like a friend, if you feel like you can't go to a therapist at this time or you're not ready, or a
mhm,
family member, if you feel like they've provided you the space where it's non-judgmental.
mhm,
But there are many different steps to take, even from like our routine to making a routine to self-care practices to doing things we used to do and we really enjoyed. And now we don't do it anymore because that event just like it rerouted us completely.
mhm, mhm. For sure. And so very often I hear people say, oh, one of the ways that you can also utilize in that space is to memorialize. Could you say a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
So, in the sense of like celebration of
Yeah,
life?
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
So celebrating, like thinking about their past memories or, what were they taught by this individual or what did they learn from the experience that they had with them? So we're not looking at just the situation of they're no longer in our life. We're looking at how
Mm,
did we grow within this relationship? How did it change us for maybe the better? How did it push us in a direction that we can carry like their memory with us. So we're
mhm,
not just focusing on the negative, but we're seeing how the relationship developed. Because
mhm.
grieving is like that means we've loved this person so much,
Yes.
we've cared for them so much, and
Mhm,
that's why we're grieving very hard because we made a connection.
mhm. Love it. So you touched on that point in terms of, I want to say grief is love, and there's also a book. Grief is love. Yeah, absolutely. And so I could see from that point of view as well, because you are reflecting, and that leads into that, other question in terms of what are some of the reflections that you utilize in your work.
So mainly the reflections that I utilize when it comes to grief is I remember what it is like to grieve. So I bring a very personal standpoint within my sessions because it's not about forgetting or acknowledging it never happened. It's
Mm,
about acknowledging it did happen, and we go at your pace. So I understand that grief can take years for people to a whole lifetime. It's not something that we just heal from. So like a lot of my clients will come into session and say, I want to heal. I don't want to feel this way anymore. And it's not that necessarily the idea that we're not going to feel sad for this person or
mm,
hurt. It doesn't have to be so overwhelming to
mm.
feel.
Yeah. Wow. I like what you just punctuate in terms of it doesn't have to feel, that overwhelming. And it's okay to feel in, right? Those different emotions, right? Because again, we know that feelings are subjective, right? And that looks different for everyone, but also that emotional space that you have. It's okay to lean into those spaces as well and to feel whatever emotion that comes up for you. So then as clinicians, we are normalizing that
Mhm.
those emotions are actually gifts that you were born with, right? And I
Yes.
believe that a lot of times, from working with clients, what I hear is that they were taught, even, wouldn't you say that's also cultural?
Mhm.
Yeah, the way
Very
they
much.
were taught, stuff down your emotion. Why are you crying? you
Mhm. Right.
know?
Right. And that's where that mindfulness comes in. And even the genogram, like, where
Yeah.
did this value come from? And is
Hmm.
this value working for you? So if
Yeah.
you're finding that your grandparents, parents, your siblings are all stuffing their emotions away, is that working for you? If it's not, what would you want to do differently?
Hmm. Absolutely. Well said. So, is there an emerging story for children navigating grief versus the adults? I know you touched on that briefly, but
Mhm.
is there an emerging, story?
There is. It comes down to how parents can be there for their kids when they're grieving. And in
Mm,
some situations, it might be the first time a parent has ever grieved before. So that you have the parent and then the parent's trying to be a parent to their kid and
mhm,
grieve at the same time. And I think just providing that space for each other to be able to sit with, okay, this is our first time, we're feeling this way. It is overwhelming. Let's talk about a little bit about the feelings aspect.
mhm.
And if as a parent you can't do that for your kid, seek out help. Like
Yeah.
get that social support system going so that you can be able to process it as well as your kids.
Hmm. Nice. So you mentioned the feelings. Do you happen to work, with feelings chart? And what does that look like?
So there's a feelings wheel that you can look at, like the Calm app has it, or even their
Mhm,
website, and you can download it. And it talks about like the primary feelings. So we might feel happy, sadness, anger.
mhm.
A lot of people just know those few emotions, but
Oh,
happy can go to joy,
mhm,
excitement,
mhm,
being ecstatic, energized. Anger
mhm,
could go to being irritable, frustrated, um, erratic. So it can be so many different emotions just from one.
mhm,
And emotions can ping pong off each other. So if we're not mindful of what we're feeling this moment, we can feel sad. And then all of a sudden, we're being mean to a friend or taking it out on someone, and they're not understanding why. And it's
mhm.
because we haven't really processed the feeling that we're having at that moment.
Well said. So, if you were to just explore that some more in terms of someone feeling angry when they're navigating that grief,
Mhm.
how would you work with them through that anger?
So with grief, we would focus on like maybe their stuck points. So
Hmm.
whether they're creating a list or we're going over all the thoughts that they're having in that moment, and
Hmm.
then we kind of will rank them. Which one gives you the most intense, overwhelmed feeling? So even if they can't say anger, they
Yeah.
say my body just feels so tight when I think about this thought,
Yeah.
compared to I think about this thought and I feel frustrated, but I can go to work.
Mm-hmm.
So we rank them and then we see, okay, you had this thought, and we use maybe a CBT relational approach of you've
Mm-hmm.
had this thought, this feeling's popping up, and then this is your action, whether it's dissociating or not talking about it or retaliating. Then we look at it as a whole picture. Is this something that's realistic for you? Is this something you want to continue to do?
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, how would you change it? What would you break? What pattern would you change?
Beautiful. So, very often, as you mentioned, the CBT, can you say a little bit more about that for our audience who are listening and they're wondering what is CBT and how, are you able to sit with clients, and work from that lens then?
So, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, and it focuses on our thoughts, feelings, and actions. So,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes our thoughts might not be realistic in that moment, and it's providing an overwhelming feeling for us where we either shut down or retaliate. So, like a thought that we might have is like, I'm never going to get over this. And every time we wake up, we think about that. I'm never going to get over this. This job is the worst thing I've ever done in my life. And then
Mm-hmm.
we're starting off our day like that. So how is our day going to move forward? It's going to be very negative. It's going to be down. It's going to be, I can't find anything positive in the day happening, which then inevitably might take our action to be distancing ourselves from our support system and not wanting to talk to family.
Mm-hmm.
So our thoughts kind of navigate how we go through the day emotionally and action wise.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So I noticed you said support system. What does that look like for, individuals who are navigating, stressors?
Yeah. So there are different types of support systems. The healthiest one that I can think of is having a secure one. And what
Mm-hmm.
a secure relationship or support system is we're able to talk to someone about what's going on and we feel comforted, validated. They're not talking to us in the way that they're lying to us. They're talking to us in the way that they care for us and they see the pain that we're going through. And we don't feel judged based off their comments or how they try to care for us. We feel welcomed.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get in trouble for expressing an emotion or
Yeah.
a thought. And they're more receptive to understand why we're having that thought and feeling.
Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times I would hear people, talk about, well, someone told them, get over it already. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yeah, that doesn't really sit well with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or the platitudes of, well, it's life, that happens, move on, And as you mentioned in the beginning, grief is not linear, it is a
Yeah.
process, right? And so I absolutely, love the idea of what you mentioned in terms of that healing.
Mhm.
And do you absolutely think, as you talked about that someone who's navigating grief can experience two things at once?
Oh,
What does
yes.
that look like?
They can experience 100% love and respect for the person and then be angry that the
Mhm.
situation happened at the same time
Yeah.
because it didn't go their way.
Mhm.
And I love how you said, like, oh, just forget about it, like, get over it, like grief, we can do that.
Mhm.
And it reminded me of, I don't know if you've seen the show on Netflix, Black Mirrors, that there's an episode in there that focuses on the loss of a relationship. I
Oh.
don't know if they were married or a
Mhm.
couple, and they go to this person to be able to take the memory out of their head so that they don't
Whew.
have to grieve anymore and they forget the relationship ever happened. That
Wow.
doesn't exist. If that did, then how would we be able to learn the relationship or, what love really is if we're trying to
Mhm.
always erase it?
Mhm. Wow, that was a nice example of how one can go through. So we talked about grief, in essence of what that looks like. Can you say a little bit more about a relational or friendship loss that someone may be experiencing?
Yeah. So if you've had a friendship or you're in a relationship for, let's say, a year,
Hmm.
you have built maybe your schedule around the relationship. You've taken an effort, you've put so much energy to get to know this person, understand them. Um, in some relationships, if we focus only on the other person and we forget ourselves, and
Hmm.
that relationship breaks and we're no longer seeing them anymore as a friendship or a partner, then our identity goes away. We feel like we don't know who we are, and it's because we developed a codependency on this other person. So now we're grieving the relationship loss, the individual that we're no longer talking to, and ourselves, because we were one person before the relationship, and then the relationship changed us, and then we don't know who we are right now. So those can be like 3-4 different levels of grief. But let's say it was a secure relationship and we really, had our own identities and there was no codependency. You can still feel like, wow, I'm so happy I had this opportunity to get to know this wonderful person. And I'm also sad that I don't really have that same type of relationship. And I'm seeing that the relationship changed, the dynamics change.
Beautiful. So as you talked about that, I also heard a theme of attachment.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
And what would that look like in terms of, just attaching yourself to this person? And again, I thought about this notion of grief is not just someone, but can you say when it's something like a dog? Like, talk about that.
Oh, of course. Like pet grief is like a real thing. You have had this dog or a pet for many years. You've taken care of them as like they're your baby. And when that relationship is no longer there, that routine goes away. The cuddles, the feeding them, the walking, the playtime, all of that kind of, goes out the window. And it can really affect somebody emotionally and physically. Yeah.
And so, as you know, very often we may get clients who have emotional, pets. And so for them, that's a big deal. And also, in lieu of that, they may not have that support system that you mentioned earlier. So
Right.
having a pet is their way of, that fondness, to lean into that space and cuddle, as you mentioned. And so coining that in such a, profound way, it's essential for our viewers, depending on whatever time they're able to see this podcast episode, to know that we are able to normalize grief, in the sense of it can be person, it can be, a place or even a thing.
Yes, it can be objects like a photo album. It can be a pencil or a pen that someone gave to you and you cherished it and you still have it. So every time you use it, it reminds you of them. So it can be really anything, an item, a clothing, hat, products. It can be anything that reminds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So someone navigating a grief today and they're saying, I am alone. I have no one. You mentioned reaching out to therapy. And if therapy is expensive and well, we know it can be pricey, but you're not able to afford, what are some of the resources that you would recommend?
Yeah. So if they can't go through their insurance and the sliding scale is still expensive for them, there are so many support groups that are free online that they can just Google in their area, and they can even do it telehealth if they don't want to go in person. So they Google a support group, join a telehealth session. They don't have to have their camera on. They don't have to have the voice on, and they can just sit and hear other people talk, or, the speaker talk and talk about grief. And if they feel confident and they want to share their story, they have the opportunity to. And let's say they don't want to do in that format. There are many support groups that are online that they can write out their story and type it out and share stories with other people within the community of that state that they're in, or nationwide.
Yeah. At what stage, though, of their grief would you recommend group therapy as opposed to individual?
It would depend. Like if there's too much one-on-one and they feel like all the attention's on them, then group might be more ideal. If they want more individual because they don't want other people to know what they're going through or how they're grieving because they feel like they're going to be judged, like maybe it's not the right way, then that one-on-one would be beneficial, so that they have the space to talk about what's happening. Yeah. And then there's also the support lines. Like I know there's a lot of crisis hotlines that they could use. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be suicidal or in a big crisis. They can just send a message saying, I'm really struggling because I just lost, this person, or my relationship broke up, just to talk to someone who is licensed and get a little bit of guidance.
Yeah. I like the fact that you mentioned suicidality, because we know that as we wrap up, could you say a little bit about how depression is also tied into grief a little bit?
Yes. Um, Depression is tied into grief if we're looking at like symptoms related. We feel
Yeah.
down, isolated, we can't get out of bed.
Mhm.
We can also be, going to work every day and keeping the same routine and still be depressed, still
Mhm.
feel overwhelmed and discouraged or dissociated. The suicide thoughts come into place when we feel like there's no way out. We can't escape. No one's there to talk to us about it. We're going through the same routine day after day after day. It doesn't stop. And the only way to have some kind of hope is doing something different. If this is not working out for you, you're feeling this way and you don't like it anymore, that should be the green flag to say, I need to go talk to
Yeah,
somebody.
yeah, yeah. Nicely said. So we have viewers here with us today. If you choose to, ask a question, Dr. Catherine is able to respond to your questions. And I think, we value that as well in this community. And we also thank you for taking the time out to be in this space where we are able to share and to, as I've often said, this is not an alternative for therapy, but is, we're here as you heal to gather, resources, information, and that you find useful. So if you choose to do so, you may ask a question or, drop a comment in, the chat. And we really appreciate that. So as you think about that, so what would be your takeaway, Dr. Catherine, as we wrap up today's episode?
I think the takeaway would be that grief is not linear. There's no right way to grieve. If you want to scream at the top of your lungs, if you want to cry it out, if you want to rip paper, like do what you feel like you need to do to release that anger or those emotions in a healthy way. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a harmful way. It can be in a healthy way where you're reaching out to people, you're going for a run, swimming, maybe taking a bubble bath,
Yes.
doing certain things that helps you bring you back to you.
Yeah. I like that. So you're also suggesting self-care can
Yeah.
be useful during the time of grief.
Yes. Self-care and connection.
Yes, I love it. Cece, we will subscribe to that.
Yeah.
Self-care and connection. I absolutely love it. And because you have shared so many gems, where can our, community connect with you on
Of
your
course.
social handles?
So social handles, they can connect at Dr. Catherine Puentes, and then my company website, which is the Luminescent Mind. So we have an Instagram for that, and even they can go on my webpage and get those links as well.
Mhm. Okay. Well, viewers, there you have it. Another episode with Dr. Catherine on today. And we have to say, this was such a candid conversation. And we thank you so very much for those of you who have joined. We thank you for showing up. You didn't have to, but because we value your presence and you're here, we just want to say thank you. And until the next podcast, oh, before we go, if you have not yet subscribed, it would help so, so very much if you would just subscribe. Again, you would be a part of the first to know when an episode drops. And so, with that said, we thank you. Take care of you. And if you are grieving, lean into the space, feel all the feelings, as Dr. Catherine said, utilize your your feelings chart. And we know that if that is not working for you, access services. There's so many different ways, as she mentioned, that you can access service. If you are not able to afford therapy, then there are also universities that you can, access therapy services through your local universities. Again, thank you and have a very wonderful rest of your weekend. Okay, guys, that's it for now. Take care.